Well, what happened was this woman. She looked more Caucasian, and there was this Muslim girl. Cause I know it because she was wearing a hijab, and the woman was telling her to take off her hijab, and she wasn't agreeing. And eventually, she agreed and took off her hijab, but she felt frustrated and angry. Um, and then after she ignored it and went in class. In class, everybody was giving her that rude look that she's not accepted. We don't want you in the class, and she felt attacked. I know that because of the drum.
So you're using the other text features to help you understand what was going on. Very, very good.
Thanks.
What else do people think? What happened in that?
It was very disturbing. Particularly when you see those shots of other kids with different head coverings on that were acceptable, and hers wasn't. So, yeah, it's awful.
That's racist.
Well, and it was. And if you can read the translator, we have another version that actually has the translation, but we decided to use this one instead because you have to kind of really read a lot of other things that were happening there.
It's a power balance too.
Right.
You're not allowed in class unless you do this. So you're now taking away the young lady's ability to go to school.
And
What's
so
her being herself?
Right, and so one of the things that she actually did say to her was that, you need to look like everyone else here. Do you see other people who look different? And that was when it was the shot of the empty hallway. And then so the girl says to her, but I want to wear this. And then she said, are your parents forcing you to? Right, will you get hurt if you don't wear it? And so she said no, and then she went in and she saw, the differences that way. If I could invite you to consider, that was a very explicit way in which it happened. But unfortunately, the way curriculum is often constructed, when children don't see themselves reflected in it, we do the exact same thing to them by rendering them invisible. And so that's the other piece around what happens when people become invisible. The 9% or the 2% or the one child who speaks another language, or sometimes the 98% who speak the other language, but they're not reflected in the staffing in the building. And so really there's an intersection here between not only who we hire and how we hire, but how we develop and implement curriculum that happens in schools, and how kids experience that curriculum. Because again, if we go to intention and impact, we might intend one thing, but how it's received, the impact. And that's why when we talk about developing inclusive curriculum, we must be explicit at every level. What are the questions that we need to ask? What are the ways we need to frame things so children see themselves and they see themselves being reflected? Because there's some interesting research, and you'll see a little piece of it in one of the later slides. We're talking about young black boys in schools and the rate of dropping out. Now, in the dominant discourse of our system, we talk about those kids as dropouts. So George Day at the University of Toronto refers to those children as push-outs. And the reason why is because they have not been engaged in the system. At no point do they see themselves reflected. And so what happens to them, which I think is our next slide, is that what happens to them? Amygdala hijack. And so some of you may know about amygdala hijack, but the amygdala is the part of our brain that responds when we feel like we're in danger, when we feel like something bad is about to happen. And it's an instinctual way that we respond, flight or fright, right? And what happens in that moment of hijack is we are not capable of deeper level thinking. Critical thinking stops, because at that point it's about safeguarding yourself. And research has shown us that it happens as early as grade 3 or 4. Kids who drop out of high school, their first memories of feeling disconnected from school as early as grade 3 or grade 4. The reality is though, it happens in kindergarten, it happens in grade 1, and it happens in grade 12. At every level, if a child feels like they're not present in the conversation or they cannot bring themselves in because there isn't any room for it, it's no longer authentic learning for them.
You know, if you were here for the student panel on Wednesday, every single one of the kids on that panel had experienced a moment or many moments like this. And each of them told us their stories, and it would go back to junior kindergarten. At age 4, I remember when this happened. I remember when this teacher put me in the corner. I remember when I didn't have money for a trip. I remember when I didn't know what bathroom to go to. They all had stories.
And when we think about those who are already at risk in our system, think about our ELL students, our identified students, and we think about them, they're experiencing amygdala hijack already. What that young lady in that video that we just showed you was experiencing was amygdala hijack. And that's what we do to our children, in part by who we hire constructs curriculum, but also the curriculum supports and the pieces that we use to support teaching in class. If kids don't see themselves reflected, they have nothing to latch onto. So if I'm in a school where 45% of my students are Tamil, and another 40% of them are Chinese, and I have no Tamil speaking or Chinese speaking staff, Mandarin and Cantonese speaking staff, that's a problem, because we've erased those children from the conversation based on the assumption that, this is what we say, good teaching is good teaching, so it doesn't matter. And of course good teaching is good teaching. And of course good teaching, effective teaching practice, can help children in any kind of situation be able to rise and move on. But here's the problem with that. We don't know what we don't know. And so when we put things, for example, set projects around Eid or Diwali, or we celebrate Christmas in a really big, grandiose way, but there's nothing about Chinese New Year, which defines how a group of people see their journey into another year. It's a huge, huge part of who they are.
Or if you do acknowledge the Chinese New Year, but you do it at Christmas time, even though it falls at the end of January or beginning of February.
So you call it the holiday concert, and you lump everything in at Christmas time, right? So that we're making space for them. That's the conversation. We're making space for them. And we should not be making space. We're supposed to be recreating spaces and transforming spaces and changing the dialogue. And unless we get to that piece, right, here's some good questions to think about. And when we think about how we construct curriculum and the curriculum that is taught in classes and the supports that we provide, how does my Finnish child from Finland, who speaks Cantonese, who now lives in Markham, see themselves represented in what is going on? I used to hand, it horrifies me, some of the books that we use, that we say, use this to create your curriculum from. Honestly, my view on the history textbook is they need to be thrown in the garbage, because they erase many people from the conversation. I used to say to my students, for example, what are we going to learn? And they always look at me being very confused and say, Mr. Chang, we're going to learn history. And I'm like, well, I want you to look at the book and tell me what we're going to learn. So they'd start flipping through, and eventually somebody will say, well, there's a lot of white men in here. So I said, well, that's okay, because women didn't have anything to do with Canadian history. And my girls would get really upset, and they're like, how can you say that? I said, well, they're not in there, so clearly they did nothing. And then I would say, and all the Chinese did was they built the railroad. That's the only contribution that they gave to Canada. And my Chinese students would be angry with me. I said, but that's what the book says, right? And all the First Nations ever did was they helped the pioneers. That's how they helped us. And then they start thinking and go, do you think we're actually learning Canadian history here? And then they're like, no. Because I knew that we needed to reconstruct the dialogue. But that's when we talk about inquiry and we talk about authentic learning. How do children see themselves reflected in those things? When we talk about what success looks like, when we look in our buildings, the images of success. What is the image of success? You know, I think it was,
Bright lights.
you know, what is the, I forget the name.
I told this story in our last presentation when, it was a while ago that I was teaching, it was 9 years ago, but I was teaching at a school in Toronto, which is where that's where I had my teaching jobs. And my school was predominantly from rural Vietnam, but the kids were Canadian born and Guyanese. And it was grade 5, we were doing government, and I asked them to take their paper, fold it in half, draw a picture of a Canadian citizen. Every single child in my grade 5 classroom was a Canadian citizen except for one. Every single one of them, and they were predominantly Vietnamese and Guyanese, so brown, drew a white person with blonde hair and blue eyes. And ironically, the only child in the class who wasn't a Canadian citizen was a Russian boy named Vlad, who was blonde and blue-eyed. So I asked them, are you Canadian? Yeah, we are. So, but that doesn't look like you. And you have to make them, show them how you question. Another experience I had teaching grade 4 when you have to do medieval times. And they're asked to look at, talk about the holidays, talk about the traditions, talk about the food, talk about the dress. And there were a bunch of Muslim students in my class, and they were doing the holidays, and they started to write about Christmas and how Christmas was celebrated in the Middle Ages or in medieval times. And I said, well, what about, I said, you're Muslim, what about Muslim holidays? And they said, there were no Muslim people in medieval times. So it makes us really question, what is it that we're just okay with? If we teach medieval times around knights and
Rome and Greece and those civilizations.
And the Holy Grail, then what we're limiting is the conversation, the other narratives that are erased from our textbooks.
Right.
And that's why when we look at how we construct curriculum, we have to think about who is in the conversation. And when we construct it at the table, who is at the table and how many voices are not there? So who are the people we need to speak to change that curriculum conversation? Because if it only comes from people who look one way, have one experience, speak one way, they might have some insights into some things, but they will not have insights into many things because we don't know what we don't know. Just behind you, Nancy.
Alright, yeah, I would just like to add on to that because I remember I took an entrepreneurship course, right, and pretty much one of our first activities was to draw our interpretation of what we thought a successful entrepreneur was, so like a successful businessman. And we just had to draw and like list the characteristics that they might have. And every single person in the class drew a white man with a fancy suit with like a top hat and stuff like that. So it just goes back to the situation like where we assume that if you're successful, you have to be white and like all this and that. When in reality, it's all multicultural and there's diversity amongst all of us.
I don't know business. White people.
And really, when we think about the change, the shift, the superpowers that are emerging are going to be India and China.
Yes.
And how have we constructed curriculum for children to understand that? It's not even there. No one's engaging that conversation at all anywhere.
I'm going to add another challenge to that Mainline Pathways have firmly on. That we look at success not just in those realms right now, but what we are teaching towards a pathway to what success looks like. Because if you were to take the gender, the culture, ethnicity, all those pieces out and ask someone to define success going forward, it's going to look like a doctor, lawyer, and engineer all in one. And how do we teach and how do we hire to ensure we have an equitable system that people understand really what the scope of the same concern in cultural diversity talks about the workplace diversity and the destination openness that we need to have for all our kids. And some of those hiring decisions we base also reflect that perhaps a band needs to be part of that focus to see whose experiences will help enable a similar role model or similar openness to change that will provide success for our students.
I've had an actual aha moment because we've been having these conversations conversations about, what do you mean when you say that, because I work in the curriculum department, and your work has been, but the curriculum isn't explicit enough in terms of the work that we're doing in our board around equity issues, and I have not been able to see what you're saying. Now I understand that what you're saying is that everything comes from a Western perspective, a Western viewpoint, and that's our frame. And then so when we add on the equity pieces on top of that, it isn't really doing what we need to do. So it's been a nice little aha moment, so thank you very much for that.
Thank you for sharing, because
And I can take that back, because it'll help us to better understand.
And this is actually just, this is our longer workshop, and we're happy at some point to come and do that with you, if you would like. Somebody had their hand up. Yeah.
You know what, you said how to improve the curriculum in a variety of ways, but don't you, teacher, you notice so much that some kids don't notice, but don't you think the best way to notice how to improve the curriculum is by asking the children themselves what are the impacts on the curriculum they're learning and how they would like to improve it?
Sorry.
I know.
Very wise, good job.
I've been talking this whole day, so.
But I taught Massey, and I know where Massey comes from, so this is personal for me as well. So you're right, Massey. So when we think about perspectives, whose perspective do we bring to the table? What is the map that we draw for our students? Right? What's the map? But think about it. Because really, when we just add it on at the end after we've done the dominant construction, we're not actually honoring the voices from an authentic perspective. This map is according to the First Nations, the way the First Nations lived in North America. Right? So you have so in our school, for example, I have no students who have yet identified as being First Nations, but on our wall, there's a quote in Ojibwe that's painted on that's really big to honor the fact that we are in Ojibwe territory. This is our heritage, and it's not translated. And there's a reason why it's not translated. On the top floor of the building, we have quotes in many different languages that reflect our students, in Cantonese and Tamil, in Hindi, in Punjabi, in Urdu, and we have not translated it. Because all of a sudden, we have shifted the power dynamics of English being the dominant platform for discourse. And we've now made allowances for students who come from a different linguistic place to be able to own that and now be the expert in something that happens in the building. So this is something for us to remember. Dr. Muhammad said it this morning. Schools don't exist outside of a political, social reality. Look at the date of that comment, when Lord Macaulay would have said that. This is not to say that everything was great in India at the time, but I want you to understand that there's a definite political context to the way schooling was constructed, because this became the basis by which schooling in India developed, was then transplanted to Africa, was then taken to the Caribbean, so that everything that was Western was seen as being, that's what we strive towards. Right? Yeah, absolutely. And so think about how this then works. Think about how this then works for 58% of our Aboriginal students, our First Nation students. Think about the 40% push out, not drop out, push out rate of our Black students.
I have a friend that I met here. I used to work with him at the ministry, and he's now a superintendent in the northern part of Ontario. And he said that he was questioned by the Ministry of Education, how are you opening a new school? He opened an alternative school. Your population is going down. He brought all the kids, all the First Nations kids. He's got 100 extra kids now in his school who were out of school. And he's opened a school with them in it. He said 80% of the population was First Nations and there was no representation of them within the school.
And so when we think about this, one of the best things I have for some of my young black boys in school, right, in my school right now, are 2 black male staff members, a teacher and an education assistant. And I'll tell you, in hiring, the interview wasn't polished, but both the principal and I saw the greatness that was in that candidate. We hired them. Has made the world of difference. Now, let me problematize one thing that I'm saying. Just because the body looks a certain way doesn't mean they're bringing the consciousness of the reality into the perspective. All right? So I'm saying to you we need that diversity, but I'm also problematizing it for you because what we're looking for is the consciousness of the lived experience and the ability for a child to see someone who they can relate to and for communities to be able to relate to. Because when they won't come to us, because we represent the institution, they will find my Tamil teachers, they will find my Vietnamese teacher, they will find my Cantonese speaking education assistant, right? They will find them and say, here's what's going on. And then they come to me and I say, okay, I have a problem I need to deal with. So this is a parent perspective of that engagement.
I'm shaking in my boots, it's not because you intimidate me. Yeah, and I'm not even bald. Yeah, that's true. But I'm going to talk a little bit about my perspective as a parent. I'll declare I'm a survivor. I'm a survivor of 2 teenage kids. But more importantly, I find the question whether we are partners or not an interesting question because on the one hand, partnership implies some form of equality and I don't think it exists. Once I send my child to school, I really don't know what the hell is going on until they do something terrible and then I'm the first one to know. But the other thing is that as an immigrant parent, as a woman of color, I find it really interesting that nobody in the school system ever really wants to deal with issues of race. And racism to me is a hugely problematic issue because it impacts the way the teachers deal with my kids and what they teach my kids. I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm naive, but to me knowledge is not neutral. To me racism is not produced by ignorance, it's produced by knowledge. It's a particular kind of knowledge, but it perpetuates a particular location where my child finds his or himself or herself. And if that is not unpacked, then it is a huge problem. Now, I'm not being a difficult parent, please. I am difficult, I realize, but I'm not trying to be. It's just that it makes me feel very helpless when I see the pathologizing that goes on of culturally diverse communities. And you know what? We are getting more and more diverse. Whether we like it or not, we are here to stay. So, get over it and deal with it. But what I find is that the more certain communities get pathologized, and in Canada we are really interesting because first we were multicultural, so we wouldn't talk about race because we talked about multiculturalism. But now we don't like cultures of certain people, so now we are just multi. Because some communities are so pathologized on the basis of their culture, which to me is a euphemism for race in the first place, that now the teacher's role is not just to disseminate whatever they think is information, but they've got to somehow bring my child who could be subject to Neanderthal traditional barbaric values into the modern times. And you're telling me there has to be a partnership. I mean, if we are not antagonistic and at each other's throat, it's a surprise. It's because we are very polite. But the fact still remains there's stuff that goes on in the school system that my children hear that not only negates where they are coming from, it never ever even legitimizes it. And I think it's a huge problem, and I can explain it to you. Like I may be an immigrant, but that's not my profession. That's a mistake. Okay, I'm an accidental immigrant. I married someone who happened to be a Canadian. Stupid idea, but okay, I got it. So now the issue arises, why does the school system not come to me? They come to me. I tried, believe me, I tried getting onto parent council meetings, get-togethers, and all they wanted me to do was to bake cookies. Betty Crocker. Get Betty Crocker. I'm not Betty Crocker. I wanted to talk about curriculum. They don't want me to talk about it. I'm an educator myself. They don't want to know me. And I have a problem with that because I want a relationship not just with my teacher in terms of how my child's behavior is, but also what my child is learning, because learning is going to define how much internalized racism my child is going to get. So for instance, I'll give you an example. I got invited into the school system as a parent, not to talk about all the various degrees I've gotten. I've got a degree in English literature, I've got a degree in international relations, I've got a degree in international law. Hell no. To talk about arranged marriages. Because of course I'm a brown woman, so I must know something about arranged marriages. Now you explained to me, that lecture was very short. Sort of I walked in and I said, yes, I had an arranged marriage. I arranged it myself. Thank you. Can we move beyond that? But can you explain to me why when you see a brown woman, the first thing that comes to your mind is an arranged marriage, if not honor killing? So if my child is still alive, obviously honor killing is not an issue. But she's growing there, so maybe arranged marriage is. Like, that is the teacher's problem. That is the education system's problem. That's not my problem. All these immigrants that we are getting in, who are much, much better qualified than ever before in the history of immigration, they are on average higher qualified, have higher qualification skills than any Canadian average, because that's what we want, our immigration system wants. But what do? We pathologize them and culturalize them. We don't invite parents to come into the school system and talk about, quantum physics, which may actually be their field of expertise. They may be driving a cab, don't misunderstand me. Of course they're driving cabs because we want quantum physics people to come and drive cabs. That's a whole different ballgame. But in the meantime, they did a few things before they came here. So do we even go out of our way to find out what skill sets parents have? Can you imagine inviting me into the school system? Okay, my children may have something to say about that, but nevertheless, inviting me into the school system to come and speak in front of a class on Antony and Cleopatra. I actually know Antony and Cleopatra pretty well.
So just so you know, that's Uzma Shakir, who's going to be on the panel with us in a little while. But I want you to now go back to who those parents have access to in our buildings, and how do we engage parents in the construction of the curriculum that's happening. Like she talked about the way, and this video actually goes on, and she talks about how her child experienced the curriculum, right? So when we think about starting from that authentic place and what it means for it to be explicit and inclusive, there's some other ways that we need to rethink what we do. And we'll end off with the quote. We're asking you to just, think about something that, what's been new for you, what you're learning. Think about a connection maybe that you made, because you know what, this is not about judging people, this is about beginning where we're at. We're at a certain place, we've gotten to good. How do we get to great? And then how do we move from great to excellent? So it's about moving there. So what resonated with us, and what's the thing that we're going to do? So we're going to ask you just before you leave, if you could think about something that you might like to do when you leave here. And it doesn't have to, be anything to do. Definitely eat, yes.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Massey. Yeah. But, so any thoughts on what you might do? I know there's a lot in here to take in.
Well, I'd like to invite you to come to a C3 meeting in curriculum with some of these pieces.
We would be honored.
We would be honored. Anybody else?
I'm thinking I'd like to use your activity, perhaps at upcoming staff meeting. Or thereabouts.
Yeah. I know.
Or next year.
But just even to use it, with some of the leaders in my school.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to talk to both of you more about what's happening in your schools, in terms of as you engage this on a day-to-day basis. What's happening? What's being done to in the trenches.
I love that. Well, I love the video. I love that. I found that video really impactful, and perhaps going back to my college as well, think a little bit more about the activity and how something that I would like there as well.
Anything from our students?
I have something to say, but I talk so much. I mean, I don't want to get beat down.
It's okay, Massey. You can.
It's fine.
Really start in-depth thinking of what you said.
Okay.
It was really important because most teachers think about the students' academics, and this was more about socially on how to make kids feel more secure in a community.
And if you feel more secure, do you think you'll do better in school?
Yeah, you do, definitely.
Okay.
Think about how this might help someone one day if you ever get in a situation where you need to.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.